Hello everyone, and welcome to the second video in our new unit on drama covering Shakespearean drama. Today we're going to be utilizing pages 686 and 687 in your textbook. But again, if you do not have your textbook, not to fear, I'll be posting everything that you need in terms of notes in the video. So in our discussion today, we need to then look at some key terms that we're going to be utilizing throughout our discussion of Shakespeare's drama, Julius Caesar. And the first thing that we need to understand is that Shakespeare wrote his plays into three defining categories. And the first, and the one in which Julius Caesar falls, is known as a tragedy. And so this obviously is just like it sounds by its name. It's a huge giveaway. And a tragedy is marked by the downfall of the main character. So something tragic, right, befalls them and ultimately leads to their doom. A really famous example of this is Romeo and Juliet. So we have these two star-crossed lovers who can never be together, and the play ultimately ends in the death of both of our main characters and the sorrow of both of their families. The second classification of Shakespearean drama is comedy. And again, just like it sounds, it ends on a happy note, and usually it's going to contain a humorous element. So when we do talk about comedies in general, when we talk about plays, it's not that they're a comedy in the sense that we would think of a sitcom today on Netflix. Yes, they can have humorous details in them, but we classify drama as a comedy if and only if it ends on a happy note. And a good example of this is Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, where these people fall asleep in this forest and they're put under a spell and people start falling in love with the wrong person and everything goes to hell essentially. But not only is it humorous, but it also ends on a happy note with everyone, for the most part, getting the happy ending that they want. And the third classification of Shakespearean drama is history. So again, just like it sounds, these plays would chronicle the life of a particular English monarch. So a really big example of Shakespeare's is Henry V. So talking about his reign and the numerous wars that he gets involved in. And not only then are we focused on the type of classification when we talk about Shakespearean drama, but we're also then focused on certain shared characteristics that exist in any of these plays. So these characteristics that I'm going to unpack in the coming slides are not just reserved for Julius Caesar, but if you study any other Shakespearean drama, you would see they exist there as well. So over the course of this term, and specifically this unit, we're going to be studying the above characteristics through the tragedy of Julius Caesar. So I'm just going to run through them and pronounce them so we all know how they sound. And then I'm going to dive in characteristic by characteristic and explain using examples from our text, Julius Caesar, so that as we enter into our next videos and actually reading through the play, we understand what we're looking for. So the first is blank verse, and this is going to be unrhymed lines of iambic pentameter. A monologue, which is a long speech given by a character directly to the audience or another character or set of characters. A soliloquy, or soliloquies, plural, which is a long speech given by a character while alone. We also have asides, or an aside, which is a quiet remark either to the audience or to another character. We have rhetorical devices, which are persuasive techniques, and dramatic irony, which is when we as the audience or other characters in the play itself know something that one or more of the other characters do not. So without further ado, let's dive into these shared characteristics. So the first thing that we're going to see when we talk about Shakespearean drama in terms of tragedy is that every tragedy must have a tragic hero. And I've pictured one of our tragic heroes from Julius Caesar here on the right, which is Julius Caesar himself. And again, some examples of Shakespeare's tragedies that are very, very significant and important are Hamlet, for example. Again, we talked about how The Lion King is a remake or a twist on this drama. You also have Macbeth, which we saw reference to in A Long Way Gone. Again, Romeo and Juliet, one that I'm sure you are all familiar with. And then finally, Julius Caesar, the tragedy we'll be studying together. And so again, a tragedy is just a play where we have a series of actions take place that lead to the downfall of this main character or our tragic hero. And a tragic hero is not just the main character, but they need to have certain specific qualities in order to be considered a tragic hero. So the first they need to possess is this importance or high rank. So they're not a character that we see maybe once or twice in the play. They're a character who figures in the central plot itself. They also exhibit these extraordinary talents. So there's something about them, whether it's their ability to fight in battle, their ability to sway a crowd, that separates them from the rest. Also, we see that they display some tragic fall that leads to their downfall. So there's something about their character that they are usually not very aware of that leads to their demise. So for example, an error in judgment, not being able to really perceive the motives of others. Maybe perhaps they're prideful, and that is a characteristic that leads to their downfall. And then finally, we see that they face this downfall with courage and dignity. So rather than trying to flee or falling into a pathetic state of wallowing or self-pity, we see that these tragic heroes face their downfall head-on. So let's dive in then to those shared characteristics of Shakespearean drama. And the first that we're going to talk about is blank verse. So the first thing we need to understand is that Shakespeare uses verse dramas, or he writes verse dramas, meaning that the lines we're going to see in the play itself, in Julius Caesar, are written almost entirely in verse. So they're poetry. Hence why we're not ignoring and forgetting all of the time we spent in our unit on poetry. We're taking those key characteristics and bringing them into our analysis of Julius Caesar. But more than this, it's not just that Shakespeare writes his lines in poetry, but that he writes primarily in blank verse. And this is simply when you have unrhymed lines of iambic pentameter. So you can think of blank meaning that they lack this rhyme scheme. So throughout the play, as we read, we're going to see that characters will speak in verse, and that this will have that iambic pentameter beat that Shakespeare is so famous for, but we won't have that rhyming quality to them. And I've pasted one example here from your textbook, and we see that in these lines, they follow iambic pentameter. Young Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous. So you still feel that rhythmic beat, that natural human pattern of speech, and I check that with my scansion. But I also am going to pay attention to when I see Shakespeare perhaps deviate away from this iambic pentameter. Because remember, whenever I have a deviation away from iambic pentameter, or any meter for that matter, my poet is trying to identify something for me. He's trying to get me to focus in on something. And I see this deviation here in the line that I've just underlined in red. So I can read this as normal iambic pentameter. He thinks too much. However, another way that I could read this, right, rather than treating too as a syllable that is unstressed, I treat it then as one that is stressed. He thinks too much. And I see that this shift in the way that we see the pattern of speech emerging highlights this idea of thinking too much. And this is going to be one of the key characteristics that we see in Cassius, this character who's being talked about with this lean and hungry look, that he is very, very good at coming up with plans and making schemes. And this is something that I need to watch out for. One last note then about blank verse. We're going to see that for these lower class characters, meaning characters who are not my main characters, but who help to move along the plot in other ways, we see that they will break away oftentimes from speaking in iambic pentameter. And this is used by Shakespeare to show the nobility of characters. So when we read those lines from our main characters like Cassius, like Caesar, and like Brutus, who we'll be introduced to in our next video, we're going to see that they stick to iambic pentameter. The next thing that we need to talk about is monologue. And this term and the terms that I'm going to explain in a moment, you should be familiar with already from your drama classes. So this will act mostly as a refresher. But one thing we need to remember is that Shakespeare is going to use certain elements of speech that really we don't see happening often in real life. So, for example, most of the time when you go out places, you're not going to see someone stand up in the middle of the crowd and make this dramatic and long moving speech that is created with verses of iambic pentameter. You're just not going to, right? That would be very odd. But when we see it in Shakespeare's plays, we need to take them as normal, right? Because these are going to be the devices he uses to get across the element of human nature that he's trying to emphasize. So when we look at monologues first, a monologue is simply a long speech that's given by a character either directly to the audience or to another character or set of characters. And I can remember that from the breakdown of the word itself. So monos, the Latin word, right, meaning single, and legen, to speak. So when I put these together in monologue, meaning I have a single person who is speaking. One example of this that we're going to see in Julius Caesar comes specifically from Act 3, Scene 2, when Mark Antony, the only loyal character really to Caesar, makes a speech to the Roman people immediately following the death of his beloved Caesar. And he uses this speech to rile up the crowds and to remind them of Caesar and that they should be extremely upset about the death of their noble leader. And just to give you a preview, this is how his monologue begins. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. And here I'm reading that aloud, not just so that we get that rhythmic beat of that iambic pentameter, but we also see the power of this extended speech. And this particular monologue goes on for several more lines. And he uses similar diction here, right? Not only to create this beautiful image of a people who are one, these Romans who are not just friends but countrymen. They're bound together by their love of Rome, but also that they should be bound together by their love for Caesar. The next type of speech device that we have is a soliloquy, plural being soliloquies. And a soliloquy is going to look similar to a monologue. However, they are vastly different, so I want you to pay very close attention. So a soliloquy is a long speech that's given by a character while alone on the stage. And this is done to reveal their inner or their private thoughts or intentions. And again, if we look at the breakdown of the word in Latin, it's easy to remember what this word means. So solus, the Latin for alone, loqui, to speak. So a speech that is made while alone. So then the key difference here between a soliloquy and a monologue, first being that with a soliloquy, I need as the character to be completely alone. It's not that I'm giving a speech to my audience. No, I'm not even thinking about my audience. I think that I'm talking to myself and myself only. And so I'm revealing those deep inner thoughts. The second significant difference then between a soliloquy and a monologue is because I'm diving into my innermost thoughts. I don't have this pretense of having to say what I think will please people. I really dive in deep into my emotion, and so then I, as the audience, can be more accepting of what they're saying. I can believe them because they believe that they are speaking to no one. An example of this, again, comes from that same act, just a scene prior, when Mark Antony has just discovered the body of Caesar. So he walks in and he sees the mutilated corpse of his friend, and he pretends to make peace with the men who have killed him. But after everyone leaves, Mark Antony leans over the body of his friend and vows revenge on everyone who has led to his death. We see the excerpt here below. Exeunt all but Antony, who looks down at Caesar's body. Oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth, that I am meek and gentle with these butchers. So here I want to draw your attention to the fact that we have text in parentheses above. And whenever you see text in parentheses or brackets like this in Shakespearean drama, or in any drama for that matter, we call these stage directions. So it's not meant to be read as verse. It would be directions for the actors doing the play to know where to go and what to do. And this, by the way, is also how we know that Antony really is alone, hence making all of his speech afterwards a soliloquy. The third speech device that I want to talk about then is an aside. And just the way that it sounds, it's when you have these characters making quiet remarks either to the audience or to another character that no one else on the stage is supposed to hear. Right? You'll see it in the image on the slide that I've posted. It's as if you pull your friend to the side, and although there are still other people in the room with you, you are speaking to them, and they are the only one who is able to hear what you're saying. And again, you're going to have stage directions that are going to let you know when an aside is being given. For example, again from Julius Caesar, we have this character Trebonius, one of the key characters in the conspiracy to murder Caesar. And here we see him say these words, "Caesar, I will," aside. "And so near will I be that your best friends shall wish I had been further." And so here we need to ask ourselves, right? It's not just important that we know what an aside is, what a soliloquy is, what a monologue is. I need to understand why this specific device. What's the benefit of using that? And so here I can ask myself, what does this aside by Trebonius suggest about his true feelings for Caesar? And what mood is created by the aside? So here the aside is spoken almost right to the audience. And then we truly understand that Trebonius is no friend of Caesar's at all, but he is plotting something awful for him. So it creates this tense and very ominous mood about the play. The next characteristic of Shakespearean drama we need to talk about is rhetorical devices. And you should be familiar with these already. We've discussed them slightly in class, but I want to give you a brief overview of what these are because we are going to see them in numerous places in Julius Caesar. And so Shakespeare simply uses these rhetorical devices in order to persuade, right? That's what rhetoric is, the ability to speak and to persuade someone. And when we persuade someone, whether we're aware of it or not, we rely on these three appeals, right? This appeal to ethos, pathos, and logos. An appeal to ethos, as you'll see here in the diagram on the left, is one that's made by the speaker. And it's appealing to the sense of ethics or credibility of the person who is speaking. So what about me as the speaker should you listen to? What about my background makes me a credible person to talk about this? For example, in all of the craziness going on with COVID-19, I should more readily listen to someone who has a medical degree rather than someone who simply believes they're a medical expert because they are prevalent on Facebook, for example, right? Their medical degree gives them credibility over the person who is simply on YouTube or Facebook and posting things all the time. The next appeal then that I look at is appeal to pathos or emotion, and this lies with the audience, right? So If I'm the audience listening to this speaker, how are they playing to my emotions? Are they utilizing my fear, my happiness, my anger to get me to agree with them? And then finally we have logos, and logos is perceived in the very message itself. So the words that are being said, are they logical? Are they reasonable? Am I given facts and research to help really bolster what's being said? And so all of these appeals not only make the speech more memorable to the audience, but also helps to make it more convincing, and you're more likely to win over the person you're speaking to. And so we see these appeals being used in 3 key techniques, and techniques that we're going to be watching out for when we are reading Julius Caesar. And 2 of these, by the way, you're already readily familiar with through poetry. The first is repetition, and that can be repetition again of words and sounds. The second one, the new one for us, is parallelism. And this is simply when we have grammatical structures that repeat themselves. So one example you'll find in your textbook, right, is a line from Act 3, Scene 2 of Julius Caesar. And this is Brutus speaking and trying to explain why he goes along with the conspiracy. And he says, "Not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more." So you have this parallel structure being repeated. So it's not that I loved him less, I love something more. And then finally we have rhetorical questions, or questions that require no answer. Again, either because the answer is so obvious that really it is pointless to say it, or the focus is not on the question itself, or the answer really, but trying to invoke thought. The last thing that we're going to talk about today then before we end the video is dramatic irony. And I've posted an image on the left of a poster for the famous horror film Jaws. And so we know that this example is a great example of dramatic irony, again, which is when the audience or the reader knows something that most or one of the characters do not. Because here we see this woman swimming at the top, and she has no idea what lurks below the water, but we as the audience do. And this is beautiful because it creates tension in the reader, because we are powerless to do anything to stop it. We're simply sitting on the side and we're about to watch the train wreck happen. And we're going to see that this creates immense tension in the reader, and we're going to see it used a lot in Julius Caesar, particularly in the central tension that's created by the fact that we as the audience know the whole entire time that Caesar is going to be betrayed. And we are powerless to tell Caesar what's coming for him, and then we simply have to watch as the chaos and the violence unfolds. That's going to be it for today's video. In our preview for video 18, we're going to discuss some background information we have to know in order to really understand the political structure of the play. And I'm also going to introduce you to key characters. Just a simple reminder, please do make sure that you turn in your poetry essay by tomorrow, so a deadline of 11:59 p.m., so just before midnight. Again, if you're struggling or if you're having any questions, please do feel free to email me. I am more than happy to help. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in our video tomorrow.